Hello and welcome to the next episode of my Learn With Me Hydrasynth series. This is episode 1, Overview and Paradigm. So let me remind you what this series is. This is a series where you will be able to follow me going from end to end in learning and utilizing the features of, in this case, the Hydrasynth Explorer by Ashen Sound Machines. I've done something similar with the Korg Op6, which was relatively popular, so I thought this would hopefully be instructive to you all. Last episode, I did an unboxing and gave you a basic overview of the features and my initial impressions of the synthesizer. Today, I'd like to have a more detailed look at exactly what the synthesizer has to offer and provide some other insight into how you function, how you operate it, and how it works for me. So, looking at the panel, we have the volume control, which is a knob. We have a pretty standard octave up-down, and we have a chord memory button. We have a touch, pitch bend, and mod wheel. We have 37 keys. These are velocity on, velocity off, as in release velocity, and polyphonic aftertouch, so relatively expressive. We have a dedicated arpeggiator section. These are not knobs, these are actually rotary switches, very robust. We have a set of dedicated buttons for the arpeggiator. You may note the orange text below. Orange text means that we have to use Shift to access that. Another thing you may have noticed is that some of the buttons are white and some of them are orange. Logically, an orange button means you are selecting something, and a white button means you are doing something. So that's part of the UI paradigm that they follow here. The next section is the filter control section. These are knobs, and we have a button to select either filter 1 or filter 2. So we have cutoff, we have resonance, drive, or morph for those two in one section. The next section looks like this main section, but I'd like to jump over to the master control and module select. This is the main place where you will be doing sound design. Specifically, this is a control section and this is a module selection section. The control section has 4 encoders, 4 corresponding buttons, and a display divided into 4 segments where each segment corresponds to a particular button and an encoder. So to make a change to the parameter on the top left, I can turn the top left encoder, and where appropriate, I can press this button to carry out some other action. On the original Hydrasynth, there were actually 8 of these encoders and corresponding buttons. So one of the ways they've compacted the interface is only providing 4, but we have pagination, a way of moving between the different pages of this information. As well as going through them with pagination buttons, when we enter any particular section, if there are multiple pages, we can multiply press the button to move between them. Or we can use the page button. We can always hit exit to exit, or home to go back to the home view, which is actually the macro display. These I'm going to go into in a moment, but jumping over here, we have a button for voice modes. This is like monophonic, polyphonic, legato, and other voice-related features like analog style detuning. We have a button to do macro assignment, so this is a way that we can directly assign one of the macro controls, which I will explain later, to a particular target on the synthesizer. Additionally, a mod matrix button, which lets us look at the mod matrix. There are other ways to apply modulations which don't necessarily require using this, which are convenient. We have the main section with a large encoder. There's a color ring around the encoder. You can specify what color that is on a per patch basis. I don't know exactly what color scheme they've used, but you could come up with a color scheme to help you identify your patches. This is the main display, which contains the main information of the synthesizer, and if the synth only had one display, this would be it. This is the secondary display, which is for the control section. Here we have a browse button to access the browsing features for selecting patches, and those bring up a corresponding master control section, which allows us to, instead of finding patches by number, we can do it by name or by category. We have a button for saving the patch. We can hold Shift and we can access the favorites. We have a system setup button, which I used to set the velocity sensitivity of the keyboard and the aftertouch curve, but it also includes lots of other things. One of the other things I changed was I made the synthesizer output CC instead of NRPN. Now, NRPN are a combination of CCs that can convey a numeric value for a particular numbered property. The numbered property is represented as a most significant bit and least significant bit, so they're a byte rather, so they're 2 bytes. And similarly, the value can have a least significant byte and most significant byte. So 1 NRPN is 4 CC. For a lot of DAWs, NRPNs are kind of a pain to work with, and sometimes you cannot MIDI map NRPNs. So I switched it to CC mode. What that means is that some of the controls, or maybe even a lot of the controls, don't actually send out any MIDI commands, but enough of them do that I've used this as a controller for pigments. We have an init button for getting an init patch. We have a random button for randomizing in various ways. I've already showed Shift. This is a home button for getting us back to the macro display, which is the primary function of this secondary control section. We can use Shift and hit home, which will do panic. And that means whatever's playing, stop instantaneously. So if you've somehow got yourself in a state where there are stuck notes or anything else happening, that will stop all the sound right away. Now moving into this section, this is a section that reflects the signal flow of the synthesizer and all of the sections within the synthesizer. All of these are buttons, and pressing the button will take the master control section to that context. So this gives you a very quick way of navigating. This is about oscillator 1, about the mixer, about filter 2, about the pre-effects, about the amplifier, about oscillator 3. So this is a convenient way of navigating, and it brings the controls straight to this section and these 4 encoders. Let's talk through the signal flow, then I'll talk a little bit more about the general control paradigm and how I feel about it. So we have oscillator 1 and 2, which are identical. They have 2 modes, either single wave mode, meaning they just have a particular waveform that they use, or wave scan mode. Wave scan mode means that you can pick a set of waveforms like entries in a wavetable, and it can morph between them. As I mentioned, if there are multiple pages, we can repeatedly press the button to go through the different pages, or we can use page up, page down to go through them. Oscillator 1 and 2 are identical. Oscillator 3 only has the single waveform mode. It does not support wave scan. So you can think of this as not strictly a sub-oscillator, but a simplified oscillator. Additionally, we have ring mod and noise. Ring mod, you can select the sources of the ring mod, so you're not fixed to, say, oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, which can be convenient. We also have multiple colors of noise available to us, and we can mix these in the mixer section. We have the ability to solo any of the individual sources, which can be useful from a sound design perspective. We can also individually pan the oscillators and the noise, and we can specify whether the 2 filters run in parallel or in series, and in any case, what amount of the audio from each oscillator goes, and the ring mod and the noise, to each of the filters. So I think that's a pretty powerful feature. You may notice these things called mutants and wonder what they are. Well, mutants, I think, are most easily described as effects, just like effects in your DAW, but they apply to the oscillator's raw output, as opposed to where effects are normally placed at the end of the synthesis chain. These effects include things like wave stacking, like phase difference modulation, like linear FM. So they can be used to pretty great effect. And note that you have 2 of them on each of these first 2 oscillators. So that gives you a pretty huge amount of sound shaping capability without considering any of the rest of the synthesizer. In the mixer section, we've already talked about it briefly, relatively conventional. You may have noted that there were these white lines representing the signal flow, but there are also these dotted lines. Well, the dotted lines represent modulations being sent in. So this bottom row is a row of LFO modulators. They flash representing the value that they contain. So when they are completely off, they're at the minimum. When they're on, they're the maximum. So looking at the envelopes on the top row, they're all off. If I press and I release, you may notice that envelope 2 stayed on a little bit longer. So presumably the amp envelope is holding out a little longer than the filter envelope. But this is a convenient way of getting some simple visualization of how these modulation sources are working, because the modulators can be quite complex. We have two filters, as I mentioned, they can be parallel or series. They have a set of different types available to them, and they're not the same. So notice the first one for oscillator 1 is called LDR12, and the first one for, filter 1, the first one for filter 2 is called LPBP-HP. So we have a range of different filter types available. We can run them in series or parallel. We have dedicated controls for them. They move into the amp section. Nothing particularly unusual here. You can use an LFO, you can make it velocity sensitive, and you can adjust its core level. I've noticed that some of the patches are quite quiet on this synth, so sometimes you find yourself using a little filter drive or increasing this amp level just to bring the volume up. Next, we flow into the effects section. It's easy to think of these as kind of two sections, even though one is in the middle. So we have the conventional delay and reverb, which you're probably used to seeing on synthesizers. But then we have these pre and post effects. They're called pre and post in the sense that they are applied before or after the delay and reverb. The pre effects are things like chorus, distortion, a lo-fi effect, and the post effects are also similar. So you have the opportunity to apply these effects before or after the delay and reverb to various effects. Note that the parameters for almost all of these, including the modulators, including the effects, are available in the mod matrix. So you have a lot of sound design capability there. Now, I've already played with it a bit. I've already played some sounds for you, and I'd like to talk about my general feeling having used the synthesizer for a bit. I think the control paradigm is clever. I think the control paradigm is a great way of bringing a lot of parameters into a relatively small interface. There are also a lot of niceties. So for example, when I go into the editor here, if I hold Shift, I can simultaneously adjust all the different wavetable entries after the one that I'm adjusting. So that's a pretty clever strategy there. And the pagination here and the ability to navigate through the sections so rapidly is very impressive. What I would say is, for my use case, I feel like the huge amount of panel space taken up by the filter section and the arpeggiator section is not worthwhile. And let me clarify why that is. I think as a synthesizer, its big strength is in complex sound design and in modulating that complex sound design in real time using the macro controls. Because they've chosen the 4 encoders as opposed to the 8 on the Hydrasynth, you have to paginate between them. Now in practice, what I would have much rather seen is this arpeggiator section removed and replaced with an arpeggiator button. This filter control may be retained, but brought into a vertical alignment, and this whole center section moved across, and this expanded to have the full complement of 8 encoders. Because I think this layout is more optimized for live performance. but sort of live sound design, adjusting the cutoff and adjusting the arpeggiator settings. And for my use case, I don't think that is where this synth fits. I think this synth fits as an offline sound design tool where you will spend a lot of time crafting very specific patches with very specific macro controls, and having those all hands-on and available to you at all times would be great. With all that said, I think this is a very interesting synthesizer, not least because it has polyphonic aftertouch, which is very nice when used as a controller for other things. But generally, it feels like they've taken the concept of a subtractive synth and tried to take it to the nth degree to put every feature that they possibly could in. While they have managed to manage that complexity with some cleverness in the UI, I still find the user experience to be a little clunky compared to certain more conventional subtractive synths. I think that stems partly from one of the things which I like, which is live sound design. So I like, for example, to do a performance in a live context, starting from an init patch, and take that patch where I want to go as I play and I loop and I record. That isn't really viable with this synthesizer. Instead, this really rewards careful offline sound design. So I would say bear that in mind, but also remember that this is a modestly priced synthesizer. This is a very well constructed synthesizer. I want to say it's well constructed for the price, but to be fair, I would say it's well constructed for a flat, like even if it were a flagship synth, I wouldn't say it were terrible. Maybe I'd say the panel should be metal, but it is robust. Keys, no real wobble, no real creak. Excellent, excellent build quality. Very solid feeling ports on the back. Generally, a quite enjoyable experience to use. So I think that is everything that I wanted to talk about today. Hopefully that gives you a feel for the features of the synthesizer. 8-voice, subtractive, digital, polyphonic aftertouch. Tells you most of what you need to know. I hope you've been enjoying the series so far, albeit only 2 episodes. I am now, as of next episode, going to start diving into the synthesis features, which I hope is going to be the interesting part of this process for you. And I hope you will join me as we learn how to get the best out of this synthesizer. But in any case, most importantly, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining me today, and goodbye.